January 1980, Englewood, Colorado. A young woman goes missing on her way home from work.
They were very worried that something bad happened because it was so uncharacteristic of Helene to not come home.
She always took the same route. She arrived at home on time. She wasn't going out late at night.
Her body is soon discovered. She has been the victim of a terrifying and brutal ordeal.
She was found naked from the waist down and sexually assaulted.
The sheer brutality of this event, a kidnapping, a sexual assault, and then ultimately a murder, was a shock.
Detectives are concerned that the murder is linked to other assaults in the area.
There had been a number of other sexual assaults on young women in that area of about a 5-block area off of Broadway.
Obviously, people were concerned. Someone had been abducted from a bus stop in a major suburban area and ended up stabbed to death.
A major investigation launches, with investigators using every tool at their disposal and reviewing the evidence routinely. However, frustratingly, the case remains unsolved for almost 40 years.
Detectives at the time had exhausted all the leads that they had within the first few weeks, a few months of the investigation, and it went cold.
We waited, and about every 6 months, we would check with CODIS, and we didn't have any hits.
This is the story of Helene Pruszynski, the extensive and decades-long investigation into her murder and how, despite seeming unsolvable, it became another success story for the Bloodline Detectives.
I was in my office, and it was at the end of the day, and they brought me the file, and we said, "We have the suspect."
I can say with confidence this case wouldn't have been solved without genetic genealogy. It was the key.
January the 16th, 1980. Police in the city of Englewood, Colorado receive an emergency call. 21-year-old Helene Pruszynski has not returned home after work, and her aunt and friend are deeply concerned for her safety.
When Miss Pruszynski failed to show up for some time, they went to go look for her. They went up and down the Broadway corridor and looked at the bus stops and could not locate Helene. So they phoned the Englewood Police Department and filed a missing person report. Miss Pruszynski had been doing an internship at KHOW radio station. She was here from Boston. She went to Wheaton College.
She was really a very punctual young lady. She always took the same route. She arrived at home on time. She wasn't going out late at night. So when she didn't show up that night, her aunt was very concerned.
She was due home around 6:30, between 6:30 and 6:45 p.m. on January 16th. When she didn't arrive, that alarmed Miss Blixt and Kitsy Snow, her friend, who was also here on an internship from Boston. They were scared. This wasn't like her. It was very uncharacteristic. They were very worried something bad happened because it was so uncharacteristic of Helene to not come home.
With Ms. Blix clearly distraught, the case is immediately escalated to a missing persons investigation.
The Englewood Police Department mobilized pretty quickly to look into this case because, when somebody calls and they say this is not normal behavior for someone, police generally stand up and listen. Now, they were concerned about where she might be, but they also needed to get some more information from her coworkers, information about what bus routes she took. So they tried to work backwards and recreate, okay, when did she get on the bus leaving work? What time would she have arrived? And where would that be? They also had to look into whether or not she had an unknown boyfriend or other people that she liked to hang out with. And really quickly, they realized that just wasn't the case.
In those days, it was like, well, could she have gone here? Could she have gone there? And unfortunately, where she was supposed to get off on the bus, but where she got on the bus, they're in the same jurisdiction. That was a pretty populated, urban area. And the Inglewood Police Department did what they would normally do, and that is search the general areas, search the bus stops, any restaurants that she might have gone to with information from the family and friends. And then obviously, she was nowhere to be found.
While officers are following up all possible leads, they receive a call. A body has been found.
She was found naked from the waist down and sexually assaulted off of Daniels Park Road, which at that time was a very rural dirt road. The area was a rural field, essentially. It was a cold day. She was found off the west side of the roadway, fairly considerable distance, a couple of 100 feet.
It was a cold morning in January, and a woman had located what she thought was a body in an open field in Douglas County, which is now Highlands Ranch.
A lady was driving by and saw something in the field and contacted a road worker who went into the field and verified there was a body out there.
Homicide detectives and forensics attend the crime scene.
At the time, we were very small. We used a combination of our staff and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to conduct the investigation.
Only thing that she had on below her waist was a pair of socks. She had a jacket on, her blouse was pulled up, her breasts were exposed. Looked like there was some rope or something around her neck area, and her hands were tied behind her back. She was looking up in the sky.
She was stabbed, and she had a type of material around her neck that was believed to have been used as a partial gag. She was wearing a white turtleneck, green pullover sweater, and she had knee socks on, green as well. They couldn't determine at the time that she was sexually assaulted, but that was a presumption based on the way her body was found.
The Douglas County Sheriff's Office crime scene investigators took a plaster cast of a suspect boot, so a cowboy boot. It was between a size 9 and 11, and kind of set that aside for later investigation.
There was semen also collected from Miss Pruszynski and her clothing.
News of the murder spreads quickly throughout the small community.
This case garnered quite a bit of news media attention, and obviously people were concerned. Someone had been abducted from a bus stop in a major suburban area and ended up stabbed to death on a rural roadway in Douglas County. There was obviously concern in the community about that.
The sheer brutality of this event, a kidnapping, sexual assault, and then ultimately a murder, was a shock.
The Englewood Police Department begins a major crime investigation, determined to find the killer before he strikes again.
There had been a number of other sexual assaults on young women in that area of about a 5-block area off of Broadway.
There's one, actually the body was found in Denver. It was same thing. Young woman got off a bus, but the last time she was seen was in basically the same area. And then there's another case where there was a fairly well-known car dealer whose granddaughter was walking down a road. She'd gotten off the bus and she was found murdered. So they were interviewing a lot of people that rode buses, bus drivers, those kinds of things.
There were some of them that were attempts, attacks. There were others that were sexual assaults, and there was one specifically where a knife was displayed. And of course, in Helene's case, all three of those things occurred.
There were a lot of different people whose names came up that they interviewed. There was a lot of gumshoe, old school work being done on it, and they were hitting up every known sex offender, every known burglar in the area, and interviewing them, trying to see if they can identify who the killer was.
Could the attacks be linked? And if so, does the killer live in the area or travel through it?
It was unclear if this was somebody who knew her or if it was a stranger, and I think the investigators were looking at anybody and everybody they could to solve this crime.
January 1980. Police in Englewood, Colorado are launching an investigation into the brutal rape and murder of 21-year-old Helene Pruszynski.
It was just a truly random, violent act. And this was a young woman who deserved justice.
It was unclear if this was somebody who knew her or if it was a stranger, and I think the investigators were looking at anybody and everybody they could to solve this crime.
A number of witnesses have come forward, and detectives are piecing together Helene's last movements.
She had worked that day. I believe she had a milkshake and a salad for lunch.
She left KHOW Radio a little before 6. She was seen in the elevator and then exiting the elevator, and investigators were able to establish that there were a couple of riders that rode the bus with her from Denver to Englewood.
She got on the bus, was coming home, and was going to get off the bus and then walk 7 or 8 blocks home from the bus stop and then turn and go up to her aunt and uncle's house like she did for like the last week and only had a couple more weeks left in her internship.
They were casting a very wide net because clues were few and far between. They were lucky enough to have a good Samaritan who thought they had seen somebody in that field on January 16th around 10 p.m. And that person did a suspect composite sketch, but leads really didn't generate from that. And of course, this is really pre-DNA, pre-advanced forensic sciences, pre-things like, our national databases where you could search for suspects. So it was a lot of shoe leather detective work back then, asking people, neighbors door to door, had they seen anyone. They certainly looked at other possible suspects in and around the country. There were people that had confessed to this crime over the years that clearly did not commit the crime itself, but each and every single one of them was looked at.
The autopsy reveals all the details of the brutal attack.
Dr. Galloway had done the autopsy down in Castle Rock. It was determined that she was sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed 9 times in the back. She died of exsanguination, which is blood loss.
Helene's family and friends are devastated at her loss and knowing how much she's suffered.
Helene was a remarkable young woman. I think it was evident to everybody and anybody who ever read this case or had any kind of connection to this case in any way that she was a very kind soul. She was brilliant. She was a leader. She was talented, intelligent. She had all the qualities of a human being that you would want your own child to have.
You can only imagine the pain that her family went through. Police were in contact with her family. They did tell her family about some of the things that they knew. Police naturally, though, in these investigations try to withhold some information because they can use this as a way to determine whether or not somebody is truthfully confessing to a crime because they know evidence or information that other people might not.
Exploring every avenue, detectives hypnotize a witness, hoping to get a more detailed description of the killer.
It was a sketch that was done by a witness, Miss Fries. They had gotten the description of the suspect using hypnosis.
White male, mustache. I believe the Adam's apple was pretty distinct in the photo, in the composite drawing. Full head of hair, mustache at a very distinct angle going on it, wearing, I believe, jeans.
But in many ways, a fairly common face, especially with, facial hair being what it was back then.
Nothing resulted from that composite sketch at the time.
Despite using all the tools available to them, detectives run out of leads and the case goes cold.
They recovered the DNA, which in 1980, nobody really understood DNA like we do now, and kept that preserved for all these years.
Detectives at the time had exhausted all the leads that they had within the first few weeks, a few months of the investigation, and it went cold really until about 1998, when there were some advancements in DNA technology.
Well, in 1998, if you think about the O.J. Simpson trial that had happened a few years earlier, and DNA was really becoming developed as a forensic science tool. And so, of course, most of the people in law enforcement knew that in 1998, this is a time for us to start looking at some of these old cases and try to revive them, try to find a new way to investigate it. They were fortunate they were able to actually get a DNA profile using an old DNA method now in 1998 that would then go into CODIS, which is a combined DNA system that is run by the FBI, and then searches on a periodic basis to see if any other suspects or any other potential suspects in other cases match the DNA profile from Helene.
It was put into CODIS, and there were no matches found. And there was a certain amount of frustration, undoubtedly, among the investigators who were working the case. There was always some hope that the perpetrator perhaps had left DNA behind at other crime scenes or had been identified through a buccal swab at the time of arrest. But there were no matches in CODIS.
We waited, and about every 6 months, we would check with CODIS, and at the time, that program was developing itself. So I think on a couple occasions we reloaded the data into CODIS to look for any hits from anyone that might have been put in there by other criminal behavior. And we didn't have any hits.
Having reached another dead end, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office enlists help from the FBI.
So VICAP is a violent crime apprehension system where you put details of your cases into a system that can then be searched and compared against details of cases maybe in other states and other areas to find potential links to suspects that you may not know about. So the information that goes in VICAP is provided by the originating agency and then searches around.
Well, the key information in VICAP is that this was a stranger abduction. This is somebody who was much more powerful, stronger, younger, capable to control both physically and emotionally the victim, and most likely was living in the area and had been in the area and knew the area just based upon the particulars of the crime.
But the profile delivers no significant new leads, and the case goes cold again until 2013, when Sheriff Spurlock creates another task force.
Douglas County dedicated an investigator full-time to reviewing their cases within the jurisdiction.
Sheriff Spurlock was instrumental in forming the Cold Case Squad, which was a collaborative effort of not only Sheriff's Office employees, but also community volunteers with specialized expertise who came forward to assist.
I put together a cold case review team, and this was a group of multidisciplinary folks with police officers, attorneys, doctor, business professionals. All of these are people that I knew in the community that were dedicated to being a part of trying to do better.
They all have different perspectives that aren't identical to how law enforcement thinks. You put 5 cops in a room, we're all gonna have similar thoughts. And if someone says something, we're like, yeah, that could be, but we move on. Where when you have people who come from different backgrounds, it makes you stop and think and reflect on, well, I guess maybe that could have happened a different way.
We started collaborating with the sheriff's office and trying to find ways, could we advance this DNA? Is there something new that we could do? The DNA typing that they had done in 1998 hadn't become obsolete, but it was certainly old. So that was reevaluated. A new DNA profile was created and submitted into CODIS. And what that enabled us to do was work together, not just from the investigative side, but from the legal side, to try and find a way that we could take everything we knew and use it to identify and prosecute a suspect. We looked at all those unsolved sexual assaults in the Englewood area, trying to find some thread between them that we could find suspects. And we searched different people. We found possible suspects, some of whom had been deceased. We got blood cards from places in California to look at possible suspects. But we kept on hitting a dead end. We never found our suspect.
At this stage, Colorado investigators are beginning to wonder if they will ever find the person responsible for killing Helene Pruszynski.
One wasn't going to do it. The DNA would help, but you'd still need to do some good police work. And good police work wouldn't do it itself. You're still going to need some DNA.
Colorado detectives investigating the 1980 murder of 21-year-old Helene Pruszynski had almost given up, having hit numerous dead ends over almost 3 decades.
We were dealing with someone who was very, very dangerous and needed to be off the streets.
There really was nothing there for them to go on.
But in 2019, investigators learn of a groundbreaking new crime-fighting tool: genetic genealogy.
They retained Parabon, and they were selling a product that produced a composite. So they had sequenced the DNA, and really all they had to do then was put that in GEDmatch and see with a genealogist if they could solve those cases. I make it sound simple, but it's not simple.
What they did is gave us a whole new avenue to look at in regards to looking for suspects when we have DNA. Simplistically put, a DNA tree has many, many vines off of it. You just keep narrowing it down to looking for someone who might be a second cousin or a first cousin, and then get it into the family where you can get closer into the family tree.
Despite there being no match to the suspect, a number of his potential relatives were identified.
Well, they were going down a family tree, and the genealogy and the DNA really looked like this woman was potentially the mother of the person that was responsible for this. They assumed, based on a very common name, that this individual in Arizona was the person.
Parabon had given the detective at the time a possible name, and we all hopped on a plane and went to Arizona. I think there were 8 of us, and we conducted some surveillance.
One day on a Saturday, he went to the store and went to a couple of different places, and we followed him around. And when we looked in the car, he had a water bottle. It was a Poland Spring water bottle. I believe it was seltzer. That Saturday night, he went to pick up pizza, and Detective Jensen was sitting in the car with her partner and at the time, and saw him get out and lean back and like make a drinking motion and throw something in the garbage. So the rest of the group jumped in our cars, continued to follow him. They went up, and sure enough, that water bottle that we saw in the car was laying right on top. So we grabbed it. We were hopeful. We flew back the next day with it. Everybody came home.
So the work in Arizona, which we thought was a suspect, was not a match to our DNA that we could connect to genealogy.
At this stage, Metro Denver Crime Stoppers get involved and fund the investigation.
Mitch Morrissey had really pioneered the use of DNA to solve many crimes in the Denver area. And so when his company had a possible new suspect or a way to look at this DNA evidence and find a different part of the family tree, we were all in to try again.
I had done my digging, my police work digging, and came up with some possible relatives of the mother, June Estes, and I interviewed her half-sister and got a little bit of information. She'd remembered that June did have 2 boys with a husband. She couldn't remember his name, and she didn't know what happened to the boys.
They were abandoned, left with an uncle. The uncle then abandoned them a little later on in their lives. They were raised by some people they weren't even related to for a while.
He got put in a foster home, and there was a teenage son there. There was him and his brother was there too, and some other kids. And that kid was a pedophile. He was a sex offender pedophile, and all the kids were assaulted by, including him, by this person in that house. So he just grew up a very angry, non-trusting of women kid.
I ran both brothers, and yes, they both had criminal histories. William White, he had been charged and or convicted of all kinds of things. Property crimes, burglary, theft, also criminal sex acts. He had just been convicted in California of attempting to lure a child for the purposes of sex. I believe that's how the statute's written.
William White was in CODIS, so we knew he wasn't our guy.
I ultimately could never put William in Colorado, but I did put Curtis in Colorado. In fact, I put him in Douglas County during the time of Helene's murder. I was elated. I mean, when I ran his criminal history, I saw the rape conviction from Arkansas and was raped by knife point. Then when I put him in Douglas County, he'd been paroled out here in 1979, and he had been out here for almost 2 years, and he was here during Helene's murder. It was exhilarating.
The next day I come to work and Shannon's like, I know who it is. I'm like, no, you don't. And she's like, I do. I'm like, are you sure? Sure. She's like, I'm sure. I'm like, how can you be sure? She gave the rundown and I was like, oh my God, I think we have the guy. We need to go talk to the sheriff.
When doing further background checks, detectives learn that Curtis changed his name, and they get more detailed accounts of the crimes he committed.
He was born Curtis Allen White. He moved to Florida, where he assumed the identity of James Curtis Clanton. He had changed his birth date and his social security number as well. He had just assumed this whole new person.
In Arkansas in 1975, Mr. Clanton entered a home without permission. He violently raped a woman at knife point and then took her with him.
He asked her to drive him to a bus station, and he was apprehended shortly thereafter because the victim reported the crime while he was still at the bus station. So from there, he was convicted of rape and was sentenced to the Department of Corrections in Arkansas to a 20-year sentence.
While he was in jail, there was a pastor that was kind of mentoring him. His name was Darrell.
That counselor had convinced the court that he could provide a stable and healthy home for him and that he would benefit from it and be able to change his life. And so the parole board agreed to parole Curtis White out here to that home to live with that family. He was released 4 years into his sentence, paroled at 4 years.
4 years for a violent crime like that is incredibly shocking. And not just shocking, it's unjust, and it puts more people at risk. It put Helene Pruszynski in the path of a murderer.
The laws in Colorado and throughout the country were not as robust as they are today. And that's just the fact that we have to deal with. The fact that he was paroled from prison in Arkansas to Colorado, of course, opened up the opportunity for this crime to have occurred. And that's certainly upsetting to those of us in the Douglas County community.
I had had a number of cases where people were bringing stuff to me and it didn't work. And then all of a sudden we started with genealogy and we started to get more and more. And yes, when I had hopes, and then when they brought me the file, I remember it to this day. I was in my office and it was at the end of the day and they brought me the file and we said, we have the suspect. We know it's him. And we sent down a team of detectives to, one, locate him. And then once they located him, we sent down a second team of detectives with a ruse to contact him.
We would surveil him, see what his normal patterns were, and try to approach him and ask him questions to see if he could affirm whether or not he was actually in Colorado in 1980 and if he knew Helene Pruszynski.
After almost 40 years, could Colorado investigators have finally identified Helene's killer?
You know, it was hopeful. Again, you get your hopes up again, but you're guarded now, you know, because you've been hurt in a weird way, and but you have to press on.
When I found out that he was still living and he was alive and well and living in Florida, that was very exciting for me.
In December 2019, Colorado detectives fly to Florida to trail the suspected killer of Helene Pruszynski, a 21-year-old who was raped and killed in a ferocious assault in 1980.
We had a team of detectives that went down there that were assigned to the surveillance. And in one case, they followed him to a gas station where he would go in and get, have a milk and buy something else.
And so Mr. Clinton got back in his truck and drove to a lot where he discarded the milk into a trash bin. The detective looked in the dumpster and saw a milk bottle on top. Wasn't sure if it was Mr. Clinton's because it had been dark. It was early morning. And he retrieved that milk bottle and sent it back to me, and I shipped it up to CBI and they had it analyzed, and it was not a match to the unknown suspect DNA left at the scene. They were asked to stay down there a few days longer to see if they could get another sample. And on a Sunday afternoon, I believe they went into a local bar in Lake Butler where Mr. Clinton was drinking. He had been drinking out of a beer mug. One of the detectives that was in the bar was sitting there and watched those beer mugs like a hawk.
I called a local sheriff down there that we knew was friends with the owner of this bar and said, hey, you know, we need a favor. You know, we don't want to blow our cover, but we need to get this glass. The owner was close by, came in, sent the bartender away, grabbed the glasses, put them in a bag for us, and they flew them home. We didn't want them leaving their sight.
Out of the 3 beer mugs, the first one was not a match. It had a couple samples on it, a couple donors, DNA donors, but it was not a match. The second beer mug was not a match either, and the third mug had several, I think 3 or 4 different DNA samples on it, and one of them was a match.
Investigators finally get the news they've been waiting for decades to hear.
So it took a couple days, and then we got the phone call that we had a match. What the lab said is that what you need to do now is you need to get his DNA, and that will be 100% positive.
I was like, holy crap, no freaking way. And Shannon's like, I knew it was him. I knew it was him, and I'm glad she knew it was him, but it still didn't sink in yet with me, because I was so worried, like, what if this isn't him?
40 years of not facing justice in our community was far too long. And we know from prior experience in other cases that extradition, if it was fought, could take potentially years to resolve. So we coordinated to have a plane from the state of Colorado to fly him back as soon as he was willing.
We came up with a ruse, which was that we were investigating a securities fraud crime that had occurred in Colorado, in which someone had used his name, date of birth, and social security number in the commission of a financial crime. And that in investigating this financial crime, we had been unable to find a direct connection between Mr. Clanton and Colorado. We had no records of his having lived here, worked here, those types of things.
Detectives finally get a chance to interrogate Helene's killer.
I asked if he had ever been in Colorado, had ever done business in Colorado, lived in Colorado, and he admitted right away that he had been paroled from prison in Arkansas to Colorado in 1979. And I said, "Oh, paroled. Do you mind if I ask what you were paroled for?" And he leaned forward and said, "Rape." That just blew my mind. I was very surprised that he was willing to admit that.
So the conversation was winding in so many different ways, and I was anxious. I was wanting them to get to the point because I was worried that he would shut down this interview before we asked the all-important question. Finally, they did it. They slid the picture of Helene across the table and asked him, "Do you know this woman? Had you ever seen her before?"
His demeanor completely changed. He knew something was up, for sure.
And he looked at it and he said, "I don't know who that is, but if I think you're accusing me of what I think you're accusing me of, then I want an attorney. I'm done talking."
And I said, "However, I do need to advise you of something." And he said, "I know, I'm under arrest." And I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, we have a warrant for your arrest for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Helene Pruszynski." And he said, "For what?" And I said, "The kidnapping and murder of Helene Pruszynski." And he said, "You've got the wrong guy." And I said, "Well, we have your DNA in or an honor," so to which he said, "Okay." We were able to secure the use of a Colorado State Patrol twin-engine turboprop aircraft.
He was coming back from his meeting with his parole officer that he said, "You're going to get your ass thrown back in jail if you don't knock off this love triangle with Darrell and Gail."
You left the parole office, but you had it in your mind that you were going to kidnap someone for sex that night. I mean, yes or no? I don't want the words in your head.
I don't think I had planned on it that night, but I had the knife in the car, so maybe I did, maybe I don't think I was planning on it, but not coming home with my parole officer.
He had learned that anger masks pain. He just kind of came at an angle and met her, and as he was coming toward her, he showed her the knife in his hand. And he went up and put his arm around her and said, "I have a knife." She said, "I saw it." And he goes, "Come with me." And she said, "I'll go." Took her to an area where he raped her. And then he took her to the field and killed her.
When you stabbed her, did she ask you why, or did she just...
I don't think she expected me to, because I told her to get down on her knees. And I told her, I said, "Don't get up until you know I'm gone." And that's when everything else went a totally different way.
Before he stabbed her, she said, "I just want to go home." And he said, "You will, but you're going to have to walk from here. Get on your knees." And then when he stabbed her, she just gurgled.
On February the 21st, 2020, the trial of James Curtis Clanton for the murder of Helene Pruszynski starts in Douglas County.
He stated from the very beginning that he wanted to plead guilty, and he did so, and that was the right thing to do. He felt that that was the right thing to do. He didn't want to drag Helene's family and friends through the experience again.
Was there when he pled guilty. The atmosphere was tense at first, wondering was he really going to follow through with this plea, or would he change his mind at the last moment? And it was a sense of relief knowing that, yes, he had pled guilty, and we were going to move on to sentencing.
I wasn't expecting to see much remorse, but Mr. Clanton cried quite a lot. And my perspective on it was that he was genuinely grieving. I didn't get the sense that it was just grieving for the fact that he was losing his freedom and he knew that he was caught. I think that was probably part of it, was that he recognized that the game was over and he was caught. But there was at least some aspect of genuine remorse over what he did.
He did have remorse during the sentencing when several people, including Helene's sister, Janet Pruszynski, they were reading their victim impact statements. It was extremely moving. And you could see on the camera that Mr. Clanton had been, he was also emotional. He had used tissue to wipe his nose. He appeared to be crying.
I think that once the cuffs were on him, he became remorseful. I don't believe he was remorseful until that time.
He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole at 20 years. It's very gratifying. He's 62 years old and he'll probably die in prison to know that we found justice for Helene.
First, I want to start by thanking the people that are up here, some people that are up here that helped make this possible. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office Investigations Unit and our cold case review team have been working on this for well over a year.
I was on the Zoom for the sentencing. There were several witnesses who testified about the impact that this crime had had on them, friends and family of Helene. And they were very heartfelt, very emotional testimony. And after the witnesses presented their impact statements, Mr. Clanton was asked if he wished to make a statement. He said that he didn't, and the judge pronounced sentence of life in prison.
I think the 40 years he got to spend living his life was an injustice. This is a person who cruelly kidnapped, raped, and murdered a young lady who had her entire life ahead of her. And he took all those possibilities away from her. Marriage, kids, a career, happiness. And he got to have all those things.
I think the overarching theme about Helene was that she was a very loving, energetic person who was well-liked, charismatic, just a salt-of-the-earth kind of person. And her loss has been felt very viscerally for 40 years.
I don't think that hole that is missing from that person that they've lost ever gets filled again. They feel some relief in knowing what happened and who did it, but then that emptiness is there, and it's going to continue to be there. I've seen it over and over and over again. So when they say, well, at least it gives the family closure, I don't believe that. I don't think it does.
Absolutely, he deserves a death penalty if we had one. Absolutely, no doubt about it. You murdered an innocent young little girl for no reason other than your selfish anger.
Is it possible that he was involved in other crimes? Absolutely. And is that something we're still on the lookout for? Absolutely.
I believe this was completely premeditated on his behalf, and he had planned this, and he had been planning this. He had just been failing the weeks before that.
He felt that he needed to find a woman to punish because he felt like women were at the root of all of his life problems that he had had, starting from his being given up shortly after his birth by his mother, and all the problems, legal problems and otherwise, that he had had throughout his life, he blamed on women. And so he felt that he needed to punish women.
She was an unfortunate target of opportunity, and she was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
There clearly were no winners in this case. I think we were able to find justice for Helene and her family and her friends. And I think we were able to close the case, close the books on it, put people's minds at rest. But there were no winners in this case.
Helene's case would likely have remained unsolved if it wasn't for genetic genealogy.
It's a relatively new emerging technology. Some people have called it junk science. Other people have been firm adherents to it. We know that it has solved some really high-profile cases across the country. And in this case, there's no question that it solved this particular murder.
We have a number of other unsolved murders, and we received a number of phone calls from their loved ones that said, hey, are you doing that in our case? So it gave hope.
I can say with confidence this case wouldn't have been solved without genetic genealogy. It was the key to cracking this case open, and it has been for many other cases now in the last few years, old, cold cases. And it's going to continue to be the key that brings justice for more cold case victims and their families.